Never heard the word root cause of disease in the whole time I was in school, because physicians, our education is all funded by Big Pharma, the multi-million-dollar guys. You got Big Pharma, Big Sugar, Big Soda, Big Food, all getting together and doing the Big Tobacco Playbook 2.0. Now, your grandmother in 1900 had a 1.2% obesity rate. She had 0 type 2 diabetes. She had no childhood obesity. Now, 93% of the population has at least one of the signs of metabolic syndrome. 74% of the folks are overweight. It's not you. It's not the human condition. It's the 6 generations of ultra-processed foods.
When we talk about this idea of the metabolic rebellion, I know you are unbelievably passionate about talking about helping people to understand what's really going on. And I'm passionate for helping people understand how they can get healthier, right? So let's put the question to you. How excited are you for this concept of, launching this metabolic rebellion and for creating this podcast?
Well, I love it, when you're in your 60s and your kids used to call you Captain Safety, and it was not a term of endearment. You have 5 kids and they think you're Captain Safety because you're making them wear helmets and they can't have a motorcycle. For me to tell them I'm leading a rebellion, that cracks them up. But when I tell them, hey, the rebellion is this. The rebellion is, as you know, I'm super honest, and I'm going to give you the fact. What I love about this is we're cutting through, multi-million-dollar industries and the Big Tobacco 2.0. They're misinforming you. They're giving you false networks. They're giving you false science. If they do a study and doesn't come out to their favor, they throw it away or get rid of it, put it away, like the Minnesota study. They'll twist it. If Lipitor does a landmark study and they say, hey, there's actually, and it turns out there's 0.1 difference in actual death versus the other one, they'll say, oh, well, let's make that a relative risk instead of actual risk. And I go from 0.1, they'll divide it by 0.2 because so few people die in the study. And they say, oh, look, your relative risk of death is 30% decrease risk. There's, I'm going to paraphrase Mark Twain, but there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's big pharma statisticians, So we got to cut through, we're going to cut through a lot of the bullshit and kind of show you what the real studies are. And hey, look, Kevin let me do this. We call this our altruism tour. I wanted to call it our altruism science and studies, but he didn't like the acronym. So we're going to go with altruism tour. But we're not, when you're listening to these studies, the first one's going to be awesome. We're going to show you the how to lose weight, and it's actually fat weight and not, muscle. You're not going to go into adaptive thermogenesis. Here's the deal. When you come to me as a doctor, if 93% of the population has the problem, it's not you. If 74% of the folks are overweight, it's not you. It's not the human condition. The miracle population's had none of this. It's ultra-processed foods. It's 125 years of 6 generations of ultra-processed foods.
Exactly. Okay. So I know you. I know that you've spent your entire career in medicine. So let's go back to where your journey began, when you were a little child. Why don't you tell us what first drew you into wanting to become a physician and ultimately a surgeon?
Yeah, my introduction to medicine was a kind of an interesting one. I guess my parents thought it was funny. They wouldn't have thought so. But my dad was a Marine pilot. Later on, was an IBM guy. My mom was a school teacher, and we lived in a neighborhood where we didn't know any doctors. Nobody in the family was a doctor. But I had a really cool family doc who was very conscientious. And at the time, as a kid, I had horrible tonsillitis, and I had these tonsils that touched each other. So in the 1960s, the treatment for that was to give you multiple injections of antibiotics, and it was mainly penicillin back then. So the problem is, about I was 7 or 8 years old, about my 6th injection of penicillin, I had a huge anaphylactic reaction. I couldn't breathe, and I stopped breathing, and then my heart stopped and died. I slept through all the excitement, but they said it was pretty dramatic. But anyway, my parents could never really talk about it, even, till their later days. But apparently, it was a profound moment. So when I got old enough to realize, wow, what my family doctor had done for me, then I thought that's what I want to do for other people. So, I mean, how could you not?
That's fascinating. Okay, so I want to ask you, I know you've talked to me about a lot of your patients and a lot how, you've been talking with them about metabolics and their metabolism and all this stuff. So at what point in your career did you come to the realization that, look, I can't keep doing medicine this way anymore, right? I've got to get the word out. I've got to help people really understand what's going on here, help them understand that, we've been kind of duped into where we are with this eat less, move more. So at what point was it for you that you decided that it was time for you to, if you will, rebel against the system?
Oh yeah, for sure. When you have a 30-year longitudinal career, and the beauty for me is as an orthopedic surgeon who specializes in sports medicine, I'm seeing a huge strata. I'm seeing, professional athletes, semi-pro, college, high school. I'm seeing the weekend warriors. I've seen the ultra athletes, and I've got all their families who are not, not doing all. Some of them are doing some sports, some are not. So you're seeing a big cross section. So you start seeing childhood obesity and you're thinking, my gosh, I never, I look back to my parents' 1950s album and there's not an obese child in entire high school or overweight kid. And you're seeing all this childhood obesity and they're saying, well, these kids are playing video games. Well, my kids were, I had all these kids playing organized sports. And so it's like, they're not playing video games, but they're, eating tons of sugar and drinking lots of sugary drinks. But I've seen childhood obesity, which I've never seen before. I'm seeing a huge staggering increase in all the dementias, Alzheimer's to these folks that are, it turns out with a bunch of studies showing that 80% of folks that have Alzheimer's disease either had pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, but we didn't know that at the time. So I'm seeing all the modern day diseases just multiplying, cancer's going up like crazy. Then I think I had 2 or 3 epiphanies. One of them was I trained really hard. I was, I've always been in the top 20% of VO2 max because, it's calories in, calories out. So, I'll burn a lot of calories. I'll be, really aerobically fit. Well, so I did a triathlon. I was training for a triathlon. I did a 2-hour ride in Florida. I got hydrated, maybe a little dehydrated, then got in the car and my wife said, you're not going to stop at Dairy Queen. I'm like, so we drive all the way back from Florida to Texas. And then 2 days later, I ended up I couldn't breathe. And I had a bunch of blood clots and pulmonary emboli. And the only reason I didn't die because they were like nice small ones. They weren't big ones. So I asked my HEMOG guy, hey, why'd I have all these blood clots? My resting pulse rate is 45. I can go forever, and maybe I got a little dehydrated, but why did I have all these blood clots? And so he did the hypercoagulable workup on me to see if I had some genetic thing, and I didn't. He goes, so his answer was, you should have hydrated for your drive. Like, hydrating to drive? Okay, that is not the answer. So that's one. Number 2 is a few years ago, kind of around the same time, one of my poker buddies, in medicine, when you have your radiology friends, I said, hey, I think I got a gallstone. So he's looking around with the ultrasound and he goes, what the heck, man, dude, you got a fatty liver. And I told him, well, yeah, well, your car's ugly too. What does that mean? He said, no, dude. He goes, I know you. I play poker with you. You don't drink alcohol. And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, you got a fatty liver. I said, well, is that bad? And he goes, at the time, he says, well, yeah, I mean, fatty liver goes on to cirrhosis, hepatocellular carcinoma, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, that doesn't sound good. And he goes, I'm not drinking. Well, back then when he was doing it, they still thought it was all coming from alcohol. It was alcoholic fatty liver disease. Turns out it's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because it's all from fructose. So that never appeared until the 70s when you started getting all the high fructose corn syrup in your population. Everybody's eating it, and the fructose is only metabolized by your liver. So of course it's like ethanol. Alcohol is only metabolized by your liver. So now it's much bigger and more prevalent than alcoholic fatty liver disease. And now kids are getting transplanted livers because of it. But at the time, I'm like, okay, I got a fatty liver. I'm having blood clots, but the big epiphany was, again, it takes a few for an orthopedic surgeon, but I had a patient of mine that I followed for 20 years. She was a real one, I'm 6'3", she was a 6 foot tall, really wonderful college athlete, very thin, healthy, fit. And I watched her over the course of 20 years. She kept gaining weight and gaining weight. And so I was getting worried about her. I said, hey, man, I'm worried about your weight. I mean, she basically fit as morbidly obese, and she was still working out. I knew her trainer. So I knew, and I saw her out on the trails. I said, I know you're working out, and I know your trainer tells me you're working out, but we got to do something about your weight. We got to eat less, move more. She goes, well, I hate to tell you this, but you're 20 pounds overweight. I'm 50 over, but I am eating less calories than you are. And I said, there's no way. I mean, there's just no way. You're 6 feet tall. If you're 5'2", baby. So she said, I can assure you, Dr. Brotzman, I am eating less calories than you are. And I said, no, I don't think so. So she goes, well, I'm OCD. So she literally wrote down every calorie and took pictures of every calorie she ate for 2 weeks. I sat down and looked at her and said, that's crazy. She's eating so much less than I am. And she's morbidly obese. She's gaining weight like crazy. I mean, I'm overweight, but oh my gosh, something's funky here. So that's when I started reading, getting deep, getting to Kevin Hall's types of studies, where, what's happening is when you calorically restrict and you restrict calories, but you're maintaining the standard American diet and your insulin's up, you're going to go into adaptive thermogenesis. You're going to the calories you burn is going to go down, and your insulin is going to keep you from burning fat. So then I finally figured that out and got that going. And now all of our Opti clients, as you know, Kevin, our Opti clients are so excited that, oh man, I'm losing all this weight, and it's not like a GLP-1 agonist. I'm not losing my muscle. I'm losing my weight. This is awesome. We're like, yeah, but look how metabolically healthy you are. Look at all your inflammatory parameters and your oxidative parameters and your risk parameters for atherosclerosis. Yeah, but I'm losing weight. So it's kind of funny, metabolic health kind of comes hand in hand.
What do you believe are some of the biggest myths that have damaged our society today, right? What are some of those things that have impacted our national health, if you will?
I got three answers for you on the ones I like on the myths. Number one is the energy balance equation, where everybody in America comes to us at Metabolics and in my clinic and says, hey, it's eat less, move more. That's right. It's calories in, calories out. A calorie is a calorie. Those are, it's the first law of thermodynamics, Dr. Brotzman. If I'm either a sloth and I'm eating too much, I'm a glutton, or I'm a sloth. And it's my fault if I'm gaining weight. Well, that is absolutely, we're going to show in our studies, it's never worked in 85 years. No calorie restriction diet has ever worked. And all those are for closed systems. Your human body is a beautiful open system with, all types of physiologic hormonal things to keep you from starving to death at nighttime or when you're without food. But that is a totally bogus theorem brought to you by a $229 billion company who is starting to take some hits on causing obesity, type 2 diabetes, obesity-related cancers, taking a hit. That's Coca-Cola, and they generated the fake network we'll show you called the Global Energy Balance Network. Spent $119 million, got caught, and yet they still marketing for millions of dollars. Works beautifully. Everybody comes in and says, oh, it's calories in, calories out. Eat less, move more. It's never worked in 85 years. Second one is probably the cholesterol myth and the statin myth, and we're going to go into that in great detail. But of course, starts out with a guy who had 22 countries and Ancel keys. You can look it up, the Ancel keys 7-country study. A guy who was not a physician, not a researcher, had a good undergraduate degree in business. Probably made Fauci look like an honest and upright guy. This guy had moral turpitude like you wouldn't believe. So he came up with a study where he took 22 countries and he looked at saturated fat versus heart disease. And it was a random scatter pattern. It had no relation whatsoever. So he cherry picked all of them out, came up with the 7 countries that made a linear relationship. It's called the Ancel Key 7-country study. Some people say the 6-country study, and made a fake relationship and then explained why Eisenhower, the president, was having heart attacks. It was because of how much sausage he was eating. It was not because he was a chain smoker. So it's a bogus theory. We're going to go down to those statins, that will go down that path a little while. Where we're going to show you that if you take statins for several years, you get a 3.5 day increased survival if you're doing it prophylactically. Or if you've had an event, you get an extra 4.5 days of longevity if you take a statin. So those are two of the more harmful ones. I think the most current one that really hurts is the GLP-1 agonist, where everybody say, "Oh, I'm losing weight," but unfortunately, it's just basically a turbocharged caloric restriction diet. So everybody's losing weight, but 50% of the weight is their muscle, which makes them frail.
Okay, so we got all these myths. You oftentimes, I hear you talk about our Gigi Mom 6, right? You talk about that with our members. You talk about, if we go back in time and you look at our ancestors, right? Specifically, Gigi Mom 6, right? And what we can learn from her. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about who Gigi Mom 6 is and what we can learn from her?
Yeah, I like to use her as a bellwether or role model because she is not one of our perfect populations, but she's so perfect compared to ours. It's 6 generations back. So first thing you do is when you look up and you say, wow, okay, the National NHANES study shows that 93% of the population has at least one of the signs of metabolic syndrome, which is a big, cardiometabolic increased mortality, increases your mortality in cardiovascular risk. So 93% of our population is sick. We've got 74% of the folks are either obese or overweight. We've got a huge spiraling, increasing type 2 diabetes. We've got all these medical problems. And interestingly, we didn't have any of those. That's been in 6 generations of ultra-processed foods. That's a lot. That's the vegetable seed oils. That's the huge amount of sugar, ultra-processed food. And then that's also advertising. No healthy population's ever eaten 6 meals in a day. three snacks and three meals. That's all advertising. So when we started looking at all the healthy populations, the miracle populations to see, okay, we're 93% sick. We can't look within the framework of ourselves. So let's look at the miracle populations. Let's look at the Inuit. Let's look at our, hunter-gatherer ancestors. Let's look at the centenarians who lived to be 100. Let's look at the blue zones. Let's see what is everything they have that we don't have, and then let's compare what happened. And so what we did is we picked a 1900-year Gigi Mom right before we started ultra-processed food. And guess what? So Gigi Mom in 1900 had a 1.2% obesity rate. We have a 74%, overweight or obese. She had zero type 2 diabetes. She had 0.0028% type 1. We've got, almost a third of the country is either pre-diabetic or diabetic. She had no childhood obesity, and there was no soccer leagues in 1900. She had no atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. She had no plaques in her from cholesterol. Her only heart disease was from valvular disease, which was either rheumatic fever, which is infectious, or infectious endocarditis. That's our number one killer, because we have oxidized LDL cholesterol. So she had no plaques. She had no Alzheimer's disease. The only thing she had to worry about back then, they had their dementia was tertiary syphilis. Now, your grandmother, Gigi Mom 6, and mine didn't have it, but some of the bad grandmothers had that. But so, that was a different folks. But so, if you look at it critically, the top 10 causes of mortality in the U.S., we're not excluding trauma, excluding upper respiratory infections. We're never the top 10 until the last 10, 15, 20 years. It all starts with ultra-processed foods. So your Gigi Mom in 1900 had a 1.2% obesity rate. She was not running down the street. She was not a CrossFit person. She didn't have a babbling stream brook of statins going around the backyard. They invented gyms in 1930. They started running in 1970. She was churning some omega-3 butter she was a good churner on the porch, but the statins weren't rolling by, and she wasn't doing a marathon. So, we're going to show you the false paradigms of the fact that, and she wasn't as healthy as all of our other populations. She had a 5% cancer rate. We have it's now our second leading cause, 1 in 3, and they're telling us about 1 in 2. So if her 5% was higher than our miracle populations because she was already eating about 80 pounds of sugar compared to 100 years before, they had about 10 pounds of sugar. On average, we're eating 150 pounds of sugar per person per year in America.
And I've heard you talk about this for the last 2 or 3 years. The system isn't broken, right? It's not about the system. It's the way the system was built, right? That the cards are stacked against us. What did you mean by that?
I mean, if you're a consumer or an American who's trying to get, we've got a lot of people trying to be healthy. The problem is, you've got a system that's right now, it's like deja vu. You're in the big tobacco playbook 2.0. I remember, for 40 years, big tobacco said, oh, hey, cigarette smoke is not going to cause cancer and it's not addictive. And then they'd have guys in lab coats come out and, smoking Camel saying it was doctor approved. And then they fake studies and they set up fake networks. And so it turns out when you really start getting into it, you got, the $4 trillion food industry, multi-trillion dollar, you got big pharma, big sugar, big soda, big food, all getting together and doing the same exact thing. And in fact, if you read Sweet and Deadly by Murray Carpenter, they detail it. It's no wonder it's deja vu. It is the big tobacco playbook 2.0. It's basically the same consultants as it turns out. And Coca-Cola actually gave it to Big Tobacco. It's the, Sugar Research Foundation. They changed their name 3 or 4 times. They literally physically moved them down the hallway. So the problem is you got multi-trillion dollar industries. You've got Coca-Cola's, $282 billion company who's making 19 billion products a day. They're coming up with spending $119 million to tell you that it's the global energy theory. And then when you look in the Freedom of Information Acts, the executives are telling the fake network, hey, to make sure it's calories in, calories out, you got to make the population culpable. If they're gaining weight, it's not because we're giving them 29 grams of sugar, spiking their blood sugar, spiking their insulin, and insulin over 8 can only go into fat. So, and then you've got institutional capture, so you've got these vaunted public service folks that are supposed to be giving you good advice, and they're more corrupt. If you remember, whenever I say institutional capture, I think the beautiful example of that is back in the 2008 financial crisis. You had Moody's and Standard & Poor's saying, hey, these bonds, these are worth a ton of money. They're AAA. Of course, they're getting paid millions of dollars from the guys to tell them that, and $1 million if they do it. And those guys look like wussies compared to the American Heart Association, American Dietetic Association, American Diabetes Association. The ADA is getting millions of dollars from Eli Lilly and all these, drug manufacturers for diabetes. And until 2023, they wouldn't even admit that you could reverse type 2 diabetes because they're getting sponsored by millions of dollars of big corporate money. You got the American Heart Association, who does a pay for play since 1995. They'll put a little placard on there for your kids that says, oh, this is, it lowers your cholesterol. It's an A-approved product. So when your kid sits down to eat, his bowl of Honey Nut Cheerios in the pay-to-play thing for millions of bucks, AHA is going to tell you that. Of course, your child's going to get, big sugar spike, big insulin spike, big dip. And he's going to go on to, the sugar spike, insulin spike's going to give it a bump of into type 2 diabetes for kids, the pre-diabetes, obesity-related cancers. We're going to show you all these studies. So, it's just a big shell game with, the players are paying the referees, and we're just in trouble.
Sounds like insulin resistance is the common denominator that kind of underpins all of the chronic disease. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the top. There's 4 or 5 things that I think are really critical, and insulin resistance is probably root cause number 1. And we could probably channel, our Surgeon General, Casey Means, the Stanford doc. She's very impressive. She has a great book that she chronicles this. And she says insulin resistance is, the root cause of the top 10 causes of mortality, except for trauma, except for upper respiratory. Ben Bigman's also got the same thing in his book, Why We Get Sick. So she has a really good point, and I like it. And it agrees with a lot of my research. She says there's 22 tissues in the human body, and insulin, each one of these tissues has a different response to insulin resistance. And then the top 10 causes of death are essentially this response. So let me give you the background. So if you're a hunter-gatherer 2 million years ago and your pancreas was hanging out with you, your pancreas is a little bit dated. You're going along, hunter-gatherers, they would kill a deer, they'd eat the omega-3 fat and the protein. And then they would, they're like a modern day lion. They'd be waiting for some food for 2 or 3 days. They'd be fasting, drinking some water. Their insulin level's low. And so then they can burn. For what they do is they'd have a ketogenic diet. They burn their own fat, turn it into ketones. And then 3 or 4 days later, when they got another kill, another deer, then they would do the same thing. And then they would gather. They'd eat some berries on the ground, but the berries had protective fiber, so they'd eat some seasonal berries. Well, unfortunately, that's kind of what your pancreas is used to, because protein spikes your insulin and your blood sugar just a little bit. Fat doesn't spike it at all, but carbohydrates spike it quite a bit. So, and then when you ultra process it and you spin it down and you take all the fiber out, and you get a big, huge sugar spike. And then you do it 6 times a day and you get 6 big sugar spikes. Well, your pancreas is producing insulin, is trying to put all that away into energy and keep your blood sugar from having a lot of sugar remaining in it. Because if it's high, then that's type 2 diabetes. So your pancreas isn't designed to do it. So your pancreas is producing more and more insulin, trying to get these 6 blood sugar spikes that your ancestors never had. And so what happens is, as the blood sugar spikes get more and more, insulin's more and more. When your insulin's elevated, puts it away as fat. That's all it can do. Insulin's elevated, you go obesity. If your insulin can't handle it, and the blood sugar breaks through, then you have type 2 diabetes. If insulin's elevated and if you're a female and it blocks your hormone aromatase, then you can't convert testosterone to estrogen, and you got polycystic ovary disease. Insulin's elevated and it stays elevated all day long. It increases IGF-1. That's cancer. It's IGF-1 and insulin are both a huge risk for obesity-related cancer. You don't get autophagy if you're always in insulin turned on cells, IGF-1, and you don't have a chance for a break. Then that's IGF-1 equals cancer. We're going to show you a bunch of Yale and Harvard studies on that. So insulin resistance, insulin resistance is you're eating so many spiking sugars and carbs that your insulin remains high to try to keep them under control. And now they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. It's insulin resistance of the brain. It's that tissue-specific response to the brain. What happens is you get so much insulin that the brain cells say, hey, that's too much insulin. Don't bring that sugar in here. They downregulate, and you go from 50 receptors to 2. You can't get any glucose in there. That's one of the big root causes of modern day mortality that nobody had before. 6 meals a day, sugar spiking, insulin resistance. That's what type 2 diabetes is. You've got so many sugar spikes 6 times a day, you got so much insulin that after a while, all the cells say, hey, too much insulin, and it's the resistance.
You just talked a lot about, insulin resistance is kind of what underpins it. You call it's number 1 on the list, right? So how does understanding one's metabolism change the way they think, or hopefully it will change the way they think about their bodies and their futures?
Yeah, I think if you kind of start to understand, okay, hey, guess what? It's not calories in, calories out. It's what's gonna spike, for instance, my insulin. So if I drink a Diet Coke, it's not that it's 0 calories. Diet sweeteners still stimulate your tongue, stimulate your pancreas, produce insulin. Insulin by your pancreas is an interesting thing. It's a Goldilocks thing. Type 2 is when you're eating a diet that's never been seen before, where they've taken out all the protective fiber, they put in a bunch of added sugars. They've convinced you that you're going to be Betty White, and if you don't have a snack, a Snickers bar, you need your energy. So you've gone from people eating 2 to 3 times in a week, non-spiking stuff, to now you're eating 6 times a week and it's all sugar spiking. So you've got the ultra processed food spiking your glucose, spiking your insulin. So insulin, that if you have too much insulin, that's obesity, that's diabetes, that's obesity related cancers. So really, it has nothing really to do with calories in and calories out. If you drink a Diet Coke, it's not the fact it's 0 calories, it spikes your insulin. If you can't, if you say, hey, I'm going to eat 6 meals a day, but I'm going to eat, count calories, but they're all glycemic calories and keeping your insulin level. If your fasting insulin is over 8, you cannot break down fat. There's only one hormone called HSL that breaks down fat, and it's blocked when your insulin level is 8. So has any doctor ever said to you, instead of 8, eat less and move more, if they said, hey, look, we need your fasting insulin down to be 4, because if your fasting insulin's 4, you can go back and forth. You can burn your own fat and go into ketosis, or you can burn carbohydrates. If your insulin's 8, it's going to shut down. You cannot burn your own fat. So insulin is a hormone produced by your pancreas. So you need to know that you got 50 hormones. And after a while, if you get hungry, then ghrellin's going to kick in, or then you've got satiety, you've got energy partitioning. So you're a beautiful hormonal display of trying not to starve to death 2 million years ago, but now it's been usurped by that 6 meals a day, sugar spiking, obesogenic diet. It's all kind of revolves around insulin. You cannot be obese without elevated insulin. You can redistribute your fat with cortisol. You can, if you're stressed out and you're not sleeping and you got stress hormone, if you're overtraining, if you got bad things, cortisol is a stress hormone that can redistribute it into your abdomen. But you cannot be obese without elevated insulin.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. So that's a great segue to our next question. So let's talk a little bit about, how did all of this realization and, our conversations lead you to propose the idea of, hey, we should start a company doing this. We call it, I don't know, Opti Metabolics, and beyond that to say, and let's get the word out by creating a podcast. So what was the genesis for you coming to me and say, hey, Kevin, I got this idea, and we got together and decided to go after it?
Oh yeah, that's a beautiful question. I love it. So, first when you start looking and you say, okay, something's going on here, something that doesn't smell right. 93% of the population's sick. So what's the first thing you do as a competitive person? You say, okay, what's the other 7% doing that I'm not doing, right? Kevin and I were tennis buddies. We were car racing buddies, and then he's much faster than me, damn it. But anyway, we've been buddies for a while. Then he was my orthopedic patient buddy. And then if I started getting into metabolic health, as my medical assistant said, hey, Dr. Brotzman, you're the big doc making all this money doing ACL. You keep sitting in here talking to these patients about metabolic health. You're not getting paid to do this. You need to do the surgical stuff. But that's the way the system's set up. And I'm like, damn, she's right. So you're spending 45 minutes in there with these patients, but then they come back. Kevin comes back, hey man, I've lost tons of weight. I feel great. I'm good, bouncing around. But that feels better than an ACL. ACL is awesome. When, and you see their markers, hey, he doesn't have all the risk factors are going down. He's looking beautiful in his labs. He's losing weight. He's happy. So then you say, okay, hey, Kevin, he tells me, hey, we should do more with this. It's better to do it with a lot of people than 20 people. So then you get excited and you keep researching, and then you start doing your betas, and they're doing great. And then again, they're all excited. Kevin, I can tell you, oh man, I lost so much weight, and I still got my muscle. My DEXA scan, I lost 8% fat today, the last interval, and I put down 6% muscle. We're like, okay, but here's your metabolic health. Anyway, we're getting there. Kevin can say, it's pretty nice, and you lose weight and you feel great, and every time you get your quarterly labs back, it's like, this thing's actually working.
We talk about this metabolic rebellion, and something I've heard you say many a time before, that you can't take your health for granted, right? You can't. You have to take responsibility for it. In fact, you've gone on to say you've got to rebel against the system, right? If you just accept that what your doctor tells you is the right thing, take this statin, less, move more, all those things, that you are in fact turning over your health to somebody else, and you need to take it on for yourself. So tell us more about that. What does it mean to you personally?
I gotta tell you, it pisses me off because, if you think about it, it shortened my parents' lives. It takes a certain, they call it institutional capture when you've got vaunted agencies that are lying, but it pisses me off that, when I look and see that they shortened my parents' life, they're shortening our, I've had all these blood clots and issues until I kind of figured out what's going on. Struggle with obesity despite I was, had a resting heart rate in the 40s and worked out, cardio every day for 2 hours. So, and then when I sit down and think about my kids sitting down and eating a heart healthy breakfast, according to, the millions of dollars that the AHA is getting, which, it's added sugars, 27 grams of sugar and the Honey Nut Cheerios, spiking their blood sugar, spiking their insulin. And then you tell them, hey, your kids are getting overweight, not because of the sugar sweetened beverages, not because of elevated insulin, not because of the way we spiked your food. So it's going to give you a big trough and give you hypoglycemia, make you hungry 3 hours later. It's because your kids are lazy or kids are not doing enough exercise. I get a little pissed. I'm as a physician, I always tried to have my entire career. I want folks to benefit from any wisdom I picked up, which is only occasional. Sometimes it takes you 30 years, and also from personal experience. I think the best kind of person is somebody that's gone through the woes and is trying to avoid you having to go through those same perils and woes by having looked up, because you have to really. You have to go through a lot of studies. I probably got 600 studies sitting on my desk and about 60 books, and that's probably out of 2,000 studies. You got to go through a lot of studies and use, Bradford Hill statistics and my years of writing books and, ortho and then Casey Means, she's just the Stanford doctor, the Surgeon General. She just testified in Congress. Hey, I never had a nutrition class. I never had a statistics class to tell me how to evaluate these studies that are being fudged. I never was told, I never heard the word root cause, because your physicians, our education is all funded by big pharma, the multi-million dollar guys. And your physician's getting his he or she is getting their medication, their CME from big pharma. So we're going to cut through some multi-million dollar bullshit. We're just going to show you the studies, and we're not trying to sell you a mitochondrial transplant on the side. Our company assesses people's risk, but we're not wanting anything from you in this particular thing. We're just wanting to give you your physiology and tell you that, hey, if 93% of the folks have a problem, it's not you. You come to my office, you say, hey, Brotzman, I sniff glue, and what do you think that's doing to my metabolic health? I say, dude, it's 5%. That's your problem. we got a problem, and we got to switch that. But if it's 93% of the folks or 74% of the folks, that ain't you. That's something systemic. And when we show you, this is like, I'll be honest with you, when I was writing books for Mosby, Harcourt, Elsevier, I had a really cool editor, and she said at the end of it, they were still best selling. And I said, man, I think everybody's got the word. I've done 5 of these. I'm glad they sold well, but it's a lot of time. She goes, oh, we want you to keep writing some. So what's your next one going to do? So I think I'm going to do fiction. She's like, and you're too too fact oriented for fiction. But there's more supervillains in metabolic health than any Marvel study. It's almost funny, except for, like I said, they're trying to kill you off. They don't mind killing your kids and, giving them obesity and say they're not running around enough, when in fact, it's the modern ultra processed hyper palatable food supply.
Well, it's that, exactly. We are the rebels here. And I love this one because I know you're very passionate, and I'm going to ask you for one, and you're going to give me 3 or 5 or 17. So our listeners will get used to that, right? I ask for one thing and he gives me a dissertation because he's got all this stuff up here. All right. So if you could have every American unlearn one piece of medical advice that they've been given today, like what's just 1 or 3 or 17?
So you're not supposed to eat 6 meals a day. So let's go down to 2 or 3 meals. So let's act like our ancestors. We want to be metabolically flexible. So we like intermittent fasting. We like fasting. They're like fasting, mimicking things that there's many roads to Rome. So you can go ketogenic, you can go carnivore, you can go low carb, You can just eat less meals a day. You got to get your insulin level down because if you're fasting insulin, you got problems. No insulin, you can't get any energy in your cells. Too much insulin, you get a lot of energy and put stuff in the back of your buttocks and in your abdomen. So once you realize physiologically that that's the way, you've got a system of 50 hormones all working to try to keep you from starving to death 2 million years ago. You got 2 million years of that. You got 10,000 years of the agricultural revolution. You got 125 years industrialized, profitable, hyper palatable food that's addictive. Fructose is addictive. You're not going to drink any sugar sweetened beverages. You're going to look like it's your grandmother. You're going to look and say, your grandmother in 1900 recognized it. I'm going to eat it. If I see, oh, there's some blueberries and some acai berries, I'm going to eat the berries. I'm not going to grind them up and smooth them up and get a big blood sugar spike. Eat 3 times a day, not 6. I'm not going to drink alcohol at nighttime before I go to bed. All my users hate that one, but if we can convince them, we show them the studies. I'm not going to drink sugar sweetened beverages. I'm going to drink iced tea, water, green tea, unsweetened, coffee. Diet Coke has nothing to do with calories. It's still going to spike your insulin. Your tongue's not that sophisticated. It's a 2 million-year-old tongue and a 2 million-year-old pancreas. It says, hey, pancreas, here comes some sugar, about some insulin, and let's store this as fat. So the Diet Coke myth is total BS. So don't drink diet artificially sweetened things because your tongue's not that sophisticated.
Exactly. Okay. Listen, Dr. B, thank you for letting me come along on this journey with you and asking me to co-host our little rebellion here. It's going to be a quiet rebellion to start, but I can assure our listeners we're going to make some noise. We got some really exciting content coming up. We've got a whole series that we're working on to give you more background on what this metabolic health and metabolic syndrome is all about. And then stay tuned as we get closer to the holidays and the first of the year. Dr. B has been working on a whole series on, really understanding I think you like to say it, Brent, is the right way to lose weight, right? And it's certainly not involving GLP-1s. It's certainly not about calories in, calories out. And it's really understanding your metabolism so that you can lose weight in a way that you have no caloric restrictions. It's all about eating the right things and the body weight just falls off. And you and I are living proof of that, having both of us transformed our bodies pretty significantly on our protocol.
If you're running around and you lose 20, 30 pounds, we hope you'll send us an email and tell us, hey, love losing the weight. What else you guys got? I look forward to this. Come tune in with us because we're going to do some amazing stuff.